My wife started acting strangely until I installed a camera in the bedroom and found out who my wife's lover was. I always thought I knew my wife, 10 years of marriage. Trips together, evening dinners, her habits, gestures. It seemed I knew every little detail. But in the past few months, something had changed. At first, it was small things. She started coming home later from work, took her phone to the bathroom more often, and would lock the screen when I walked by. Then, the usual ease in her behavior disappeared. She became distant, often lost in thought, and responded absent-mindedly. I try not to overthink it. But one day, I realized our intimate life had practically disappeared. I tried talking to her, but she just smiled tiredly. "It's just work. I'm exhausted, you understand." I nodded and smiled back, but the feeling of anxiety wouldn't leave me. This wasn't just fatigue. It was something more. "You're hiding something." One night, I woke up by chance and noticed she wasn't in bed. The clock showed 2 a.m. I walked to the window and saw her sitting in the car in front of her house. She sat there with her hands on the steering wheel, not getting out. I watched for several minutes, but she didn't move. Was she lost in thought, or did she not want to come inside? I decided to wait. After 20 minutes, she finally stepped out, sighed deeply as if struggling with herself, and entered the house. I quickly returned to bed and pretended to be asleep. A moment later, she lay down beside me. Her body was tense. My inner voice wouldn't let me rest. In the following days, I tried to catch her in the details, but the more I tried, the worse it felt. She often left in the evenings, was reluctant to answer where she was going and why. Her phone was always with her, always on silent mode. If I unexpectedly entered the room, she would immediately close her chats. That's when the thought I feared the most began to form. She had someone else. I fought with myself. You're just imagining things. You're not the kind of person to suspect infidelity. You trust her. But the more I tried to convince myself, the louder my anxiety grew. One evening, when she said she was meeting a friend at a cafe, I offered to drive her. She refused immediately. "Oh, come on. I'll just take a taxi." "Don't worry." The next day, I called that same friend. She sounded surprised. "A cafe? We haven't seen each other in months." A cold knot formed in my stomach. She lied to me. Now, I had no doubts. I had to find out the truth. I didn't confront her. If she didn't want to talk, I would figure it out myself. I went to an electronics store and bought a hidden camera with night vision. I installed it in the bedroom, the place where she thought she was completely safe. My hands were shaking as I realized what I was doing. What if I find nothing? Then I'm just paranoid. But what if I do? My inner voice answered coldly. Then you'll know the truth, whatever it may be. I started recording and left the house. That night, I didn't sleep. What would I see? I didn't check the recordings right away. The camera had been running for 3 days, but I didn't have the courage to look. What if I saw what I had suspected all along? But on the 4th day, something inside me snapped. I poured myself a strong coffee, opened my laptop, and played the first video. Nothing. Hour after hour, I watched my wife sleep, scroll through her phone. Sometimes she would get up at night, go to the kitchen, and sit in the dark. I couldn't understand what was going on in her head. I felt like an idiot. Maybe I really had imagined everything, but on the 5th day, everything changed. She let him in. I was fast-forwarding when I suddenly noticed unusual movement. At 1 a.m., my wife was sitting on the edge of the bed, nervously gripping her phone. She was clearly waiting for someone. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock at the bedroom door. She got up, hesitated for a second. It seemed like she was unsure, but then took a deep breath and opened the door. A man stood in the hallway. I froze. But the shock wasn't that he was there. It was that I had no idea who he was. This wasn't her colleague, not a neighbor, not a mutual friend. He was a complete stranger. Who was this guy? I had expected anything. Someone from her circle, someone she saw every day. But this man was unknown. Tall, dark-haired, wearing a black jacket, around 40 years old. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but even through the screen, I could see he was tense. My wife stepped back without a word, letting him in. Rage and curiosity exploded inside me. Who the hell was he? How long had this been going on? How did she meet him? Why hadn't I noticed anything before? I wanted to storm into the house that very second and confront them. But no, If I wanted to understand what was happening, I had to stay calm. I fast-forwarded. The man closed the door behind him, but didn't approach her right away. They started talking. I couldn't hear them. The camera didn't record sound, but I saw my wife lower her eyes, her shoulders tremble. She was nervous. He stepped closer, spoke faster. His face briefly showed something harsh. And then I noticed she wasn't smiling. This didn't look like a romantic meeting. And yet, this man was in my house in the middle of the night, and my wife had let him in. I had to find out who he was. And I would. I spent the whole night replaying the recording in my head. This man, who was he? How did they meet? How long had this been going on? Why had I never suspected his existence? I needed more information. Step 1. The phone. When my wife went into the shower, I took her phone from the nightstand. My heart was pounding, but I knew I had no more than 5 minutes. The password. Damn, but I knew. She had several standard combinations. I tried her birthday, no. Our wedding date, no. I was starting to get angry, but then I remembered her sister's birth year. Click. The phone unlocked. I quickly opened. The messenger. Empty. No strange messages, no conversations. Not even a trace of deleted chats. As if she had wiped everything in advance. But I didn't believe she was that careful. I checked the gallery. No screenshots. No photos. I opened the call log. Almost all numbers were familiar. Family, friends, work. But there was one exception, an unknown number, that had appeared several times in the last week. She called him. He called her. And always late at night. I saved the number in my phone and exited the app. At that moment, the bathroom door opened. She, wrapped in a towel, briefly glanced at me. "Everything okay?" she asked, drying her hair. I smiled, placing her phone back on the nightstand. "Yeah, just wondering where your headphones were. Wanted to take them for a run." She nodded, not paying much attention. But now I knew she was hiding something. Step 2. Surveillance. I started noticing a pattern. Every 2 to 3 days, she went out in the evening, claiming to meet a friend or work late. She usually left at 9 p.m. and returned around midnight. I decided to follow her. That evening, when she once again said she was going to a cafe with Isabella, I waited for her to leave, then got in my car and followed. She didn't go to a cafe. She drove across town and stopped near a small, inconspicuous building with no signs. She got out, looked around, and went inside. I checked the time, 10 p.m. I waited. An hour passed, then another. At midnight, she finally came out. Alone. I tensed. If she was cheating, why was she leaving alone? She quickly walked to her car, got behind the wheel, but didn't drive away immediately. That's when I noticed a black car parked nearby. Someone was inside. I squinted. A man's silhouette. What kind of caution was this? They didn't meet outside. They didn't even approach each other. But it was obvious that she knew he was there. A minute later, she started her engine and drove off. Seconds later, the black car turned on its headlights and followed. I clenched the steering wheel so hard my fingers turned white. They were avoiding witnesses. But why? I started my car. I had to know the truth. The next morning, I went to that same place. Inside, it was empty. A man in his 50s stood behind the counter. "Was there a woman here last night?" "Dark hair, medium height." I described my wife as accurately as I could. The bartender frowned, thought for a moment. "Yeah, she was here around 10 p.m. Ordered tea, sat, looked at her phone, then just left." "Did anyone approach her?" "No. She barely even moved." I tensed. Was he lying? Or did he really not see? "Do you have cameras?" The bartender smirked. "This ain't a casino." I nodded and walked out. She didn't meet him there. But why was he waiting in the car? That evening, I sat in the kitchen, pretending I knew nothing. She came home, took off her coat, and walked up to me. "You look tired," she smiled. "Long day. What about you?" "Great. Met up with the girls. Haven't seen them in a while." I froze. "Which cafe?" "The usual one." I looked into her eyes. "Are you sure?" She blinked. Her gaze wavered. "What do you mean?" "You weren't at the cafe yesterday." She froze. "So, where were you?" "Tell me." She frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I mean, you're lying." She flared up. "You're making things up." "I was there, Sophia." She flinched. "You followed me." I stood up. "You were alone." "But he was there." Who's the man in the black car? She paled. This is ridiculous. Are you saying I imagined it? She turned away. You're acting crazy. I didn't push further. If she was lying, there was a reason. That night, I opened my laptop, rewound the recording, and paused at the moment he stood in the doorway. Screenshot. I uploaded the photo to a search engine. The result knocked the ground out from under me. His face had appeared in the news a year ago. Arrested on suspicion of murder. Suspected ties to criminal organizations. Case closed. I reread it. My wife was meeting with a man, once suspected of murder. Why? I couldn't sleep. The name Adrian Blackwell burned in my mind. I kept searching, reading everything I could find. For years ago, he had been arrested, suspected of murder. Case closed. But what shocked me more was this. He had been in prison, and if he had only recently been released, what connected him to my wife? I decided to wait for him to show up. She often went out in the evenings. I was sure he would come to our house. That evening, I parked a few blocks away and waited. But things didn't go as planned. At 8 p.m., she walked out of the house, quickly got in her car, and drove off. No calls, no texts. She just left. I immediately started the engine and followed. She wasn't going to a cafe, not to work, not to a friend. She was headed to a cemetery. I parked at a distance and got out, trying not to give myself away. She stepped out of the car, headed toward the old graves, and a minute later, he appeared from behind the trees. Adrian. I clenched my fists. They stood face to face. She was talking, gesturing. He listened, his head slightly bowed. Then he pulled out a small box and handed it to her. She took it with both hands. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped forward. At that moment, Adrian turned. He saw me, his eyes cold. My wife spun around, her face contorted with fear. What are you doing here? Her voice trembled. I looked only at her. And you? She clutched the box to her chest. This is not what you think. Montero stepped back. We have nothing to talk about, he said quietly and turned toward the exit. I clenched my jaw. Stop. But he was gone. I looked at my wife. What's in the box? She silently hid it behind her back. I took a step closer. Show me. Her eyes shimmered with tears. You wouldn't understand. Then explain. She shook her head. It's not the time yet. Rage consumed me. You're meeting with a criminal behind my back, and you're telling me it's not the time? She whispered. It's not what you think. I snatched the box from her hands. She gasped, but before I could open it, she tore it back from me and ran. I watched her go. What was she hiding? Adrian Blackwell had been released from prison 6 months ago, convicted of illegal arms dealing, suspected of murder. The case was closed due to lack of evidence. Why was my wife meeting with him? She often left in the evenings, always the same route. Tonight, I followed her. She wasn't going to work, or a cafe, or to a friend. She drove to the cemetery. I stopped at a distance. She stepped out of the car, holding a white chrysanthemum. Blackwell approached her. I clenched my fists. They talked. He reached out and handed her a small box. Her fingers trembled as she took it. I stepped closer. Blackwell noticed me. His eyes were cold. My wife turned around. What are you doing here? I stared at her. And you? She pressed the box against her chest. It's not what you think. Blackwell turned and left. I took a step toward her. What's inside? She hid the box behind her back. Show me. It's not time yet. Anger pulsed inside me. I ripped off the lid. Inside was an old silver pendant. I looked up. Her hands were shaking. What is this? She turned away. Answer me. She walked away without a word. I waited for her at home. She walked in without looking at me, slowly took off her coat. Sit. I pointed to the chair. She was silent. I placed the silver pendant in front of her. Now talk. Her hands trembled. Adrian is not my lover. I laughed. Of course. Then what was he doing with you at the cemetery at night? She looked up. He's from my past. I clenched my fists. Your past? So you knew him before me? She nodded. We've known each other for a long time. How long? A very long time. I slammed my hand on the table. Enough riddles. She flinched. Before you. Did you date him? She shook her head. Not like that. I was boiling inside. Then explain. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. He saved my life. I froze. She looked at me. I was different back then. Young, reckless. Got myself into trouble. Adrian pulled me out. I swallowed. What kind of trouble? She looked away. I can't say. You already said enough. She shook her head. You wouldn't understand. Try me. It doesn't concern you. It doesn't concern me that my wife is meeting with a former convict behind my back. She flinched. He asked for help. With what? She wrung her hands together. He wants to leave his past behind, but he can't. I scoffed. How noble. But what does that have to do with you? She froze. Because I'm part of his past. I was silent. I had to help him. I stood up. So you didn't betray me. You just lied to me. She lowered her head. I stared at her. Now I knew. It wasn't about cheating. But what was she hiding? That night, when she fell asleep, I searched through her old things. At the bottom of the closet, I found a box. Inside, old letters, faded photographs. I stopped at one of them. Her and Blackwell. 10 years ago. Standing close, young, smiling. She was holding his hand. She loved him. I felt my chest tighten. Why did she marry me if she loved him? Hashtag the meeting. I waited for him outside his house. When he stepped out, I spoke. We need to talk. He looked at me, recognizing me instantly. If this is about Sophia, it's about you too. He nodded. We sat on a bench in the courtyard. I showed him the old photograph. Tell me. He ran his fingers over the picture, took a deep breath. We were together. Back then. A long time ago. I remained silent. She was fire. The kind of woman who could turn your whole world upside down. He smirked. But then, I clenched my fists. What happened? He looked me in the eye. I took the blame. I froze. For what? For something I didn't do. I waited. She was in trouble. I couldn't leave her. He rubbed his neck. It was a deal. I keep quiet, and they leave her alone. My fingers went cold. You went to prison for her? He nodded. Did she wait for you? He smirked. No. Then why is she with you now? He looked at me. Because she can't forgive herself. I clenched my jaw. Does she love you? He was silent for a moment. Yes. Then why did she marry me? He looked away. Because she thought I wasn't coming back. I felt my world collapse. I was the backup plan. I tried to keep myself busy, but my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. Where was she? With whom? What was she thinking about? Was she choosing him or me? I caught myself listening to the footsteps behind the door. But time passed, and she still hadn't returned. She came back late in the evening, slowly entered the room, and lowered her gaze. In her hands was a key, the very same one. She walked to the table and placed it in front of me. I chose you. I stared at the key, a small piece of metal, a symbol of her past. I looked up. She was waiting for my reaction. I knew I should say something, but I said nothing. I wanted to feel relief, joy, but inside, there was only emptiness. I realized that sometimes forgiveness doesn't solve the problem. I looked at her. She was still my wife, but the trust was gone. And now what? She had chosen me. But would I choose her? The answer remained unspoken.